Welcome back to Season 5 of the True Blue Conversations podcast with your host, Adam Blum. G'day, podcasters. Before we get underway with True Blue Conversations, just wanted to give a huge shout out to our friend and sponsor, the Warrior U podcast, hosted by Bram Connolly. Bram is a former Special Forces commander, best-selling author, popular podcast host, and human optimization pioneer. He has an authentic style and the unique ability to not only motivate, but also take people on a journey of self-discovery. Through the Warrior U podcast, Bram interviews guests in a bid to explore all things human optimization, resilience, leadership, and coffee. His book, The Commando Way, a Special Forces Commander's Lessons for Life, Leadership and Success, is available now on amazon.com.au. So from Adam Blum and all of us here at True Blue Conversations, a big shout out to the Warrior U podcast, Bram Connolly, and his new book, The Commando Way, out now. We'd like to thank Tactical Recovery for sponsoring this show. Head on over to tacticalrecovery.com.au and use the code TRUEBLUE for one hell of a discount. Tactical Recovery, magnesium-based muscle care. Salty products for sore fuckers.
G'day, welcome to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Blum. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, former Brigadier Ian Langford, DSC and BARS, and he has joined us today to talk about his career in the Australian Army. Hi Ian, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Adam. It's a real privilege to be here, and again, I acknowledge everything you've achieved, both as a leader in, giving others the opportunity to tell their story. So I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's an absolute honour and a privilege, and we finally can sit down and make it happen with you being so busy. And we're here in the beautiful, where else but the beautiful gardens of the Australian War Memorial. I think a very fitting place to record your story. And so, Ian, can you tell us a little bit about you as a young fellow, school, hobbies and sport?
Yeah, sure. So born in 1975 in an Army family. Dad did more than 20 years in the Army, retired as a Warrant Officer Class 1, the highest rank a soldier can achieve. Went to school in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Wodonga. Finishing in 1992, played football from about age 4 or 5 all the way through to joining the Army and beyond. Cricket in summer, and was really, I think, focused on a military career from a pretty young age. Was never sort of pushed in that direction, but it kind of organically revealed itself as the best option for me. So at the height of the Great Recession of the early 90s in 1992, I filled out my form whilst finishing Year 12, and Year 12 finished on the Monday and I got on the bus on the Tuesday, and that was that.
Yeah, right. So you mentioned that your dad was in the Army, and did you have any other relatives before your dad that had served in the Army?
Yeah, he had an uncle who had served in the CMF and sort of in and around that period just past the Second World War. And then, there were distant relatives, but it really was a family, dynamic in that the Army was always there. I mean, Dad got out and got back in again in the middle of all that, but it was never too far away. There was always the odd uniform lying around the house, and certainly, it was something that was ever present in the context of his service. He served in Vietnam, and, in that context, I think there was always a fascination or an element of our family that reflected on that service.
So for you mentioned that 1992, so you finished school and then straight to Kapuka. What was that like for you as a young 17-year-old? Was it in your face? There was no political correctness back in the 90s. So what was that like for you as a young 17-year-old?
Yeah, I mean, Kapuka's pretty intimidating for anyone. When you're 17 and it's your first really formative experience as an adult, perhaps even more so. I remember arriving, I hadn't ever really shaved before, and those that have been through Kapuka, who are male, obviously, would have an element of this experience. But the first time you shave, Ideally, you don't want to do that in 15 seconds while someone's screaming at you. And there's a learning point there about being efficient with time and focused on the task at hand. But having had my first shave in the old army green uniform, which wasn't really flattering, and then rushing from there to the mess for your first breakfast, by the time I got to the mess, I think, there was more blood on my chin than there probably should have been, and I got sort of frog marched back to the lines effectively to triage the bleeding in and around my chin and face. So my first shaving experience was at Kapuka, and it was a mess. But nonetheless, to answer your question, both at the time and on reflection, I actually enjoyed Kapuka. Yep. It was 4 to a room. It was 13 weeks. Being a red tab meant that you were, in your weeks 0 to 4, and all you want to be is a blue tab, which is weeks 5 to 8, and then all you want to be is a yellow tab, which is weeks 9 to 13. I was there over Christmas.
Yep.
We didn't go home. We had the Screaming Jets come to the ORs, or the recruits mess, and play, and then I finished in, I think it was the February, joining in the November, marching out to artillery to go as a gun number, went to initial employment training at the School of Artillery in Manly, gun number course, and then posted to the 8th 12th Medium Regiment to 103 Medium Battery, which was in Sydney at the time. Again, Army was sort of challenged by issues around resources and really role. It was in the context of, again, the recession and the role of Army being really focused on rear area security and K92, which was a major exercise that happened that year as well. But, good soldiers, working hard, challenged with resources, and the kind of soldiering that, meant a lot of time sort of digging holes, driving around the bush, sitting on picket, and, occasionally the odd fire mission, which with a 155 is, a life-changing experience, shall we say. But I really enjoyed my time as a soldier, really enjoyed it.
So for you, at that time too, you were a peace army with the occasional going, like Somalia and things like. So you were joining it really at peacetime, but were you just for the grand adventure and what's coming next?
To a degree. I mean, I sort of had planned on always joining the army and going to infantry. Because of the Ready Reserve scheme, there weren't many places available for full-time soldiers, so we were more or less sent to different skill sets, and gun number was where I ended up, which was okay. But my plan was to do 2.5, 3 years as a gun number and then corps transfer to infantry, and all I wanted to be was a section commander. I mean, that was sort of the top of the pile for me, so my aim in life was to have a section of 8 or 9 infanteers, serve in a battalion that was focused on going bush and spending 6 or 7 months under a hoochie in Shoalwater Bay, or perhaps even getting a trip to Rifle Company Butterworth or what have you. And the broader context around peacetime army, again coinciding with the end of the Cold War, the peace dividend meant that military forces were sort of being taken to a different place than perhaps they once were, and therefore there was the resource issue, but I never really felt it. The army of the early 1990s was, it was an organisation that the army of today, I think, doesn't necessarily recognise or express enough gratitude for, because that's the army that actually maintained standards around individual training, especially, that got us from the end of Vietnam period through to when we started becoming operationally busy again in and around 1999 and the Interfed operation. And I think the continuity of that training system is what got Army through. And, Army, the Australian Army, trains soldiers like no other, in my view. And certainly the Army of the 1990s and the training system was outstanding. I recognised that at the time, and I reflect on it. And perhaps, again, think that it was probably underappreciated in terms of what people did to maintain those standards in pretty challenging circumstances.
So you mentioned that you obviously had some really great leaders that were leading you from post-Vietnam, and that did what you learned from them. Did you take that forward in your career from what the lessons they passed on to you?
Yeah, I mean, the training system itself, so everything from, methods of instruction, which for those that have ever done a Subject 1 course or even a recruit course would understand, it's a systemised way of imparting knowledge, and it works, right? Doctrine matters.
Yep.
Because it maintains standards, it generates things like predictive behaviour, and that's how you manage capability. The Army wasn't perfect. There were issues around how soldiers were treated. I think the conditions of service at the time left an awful lot to be desired. Again, as a 17-year-old with no real financial responsibilities, getting paid $26,000 a year as a gun number, I mean, I thought I won the lotto. Having $1,000 in the bank was a big deal. We were still paid in cash in the little yellow envelopes.
Yep.
And, there'd be somebody there with a rifle, which had no ammunition, by the way, pretending to protect the money so no one would knock it off. But, I think back on those days very fondly. I, recognise and respect the professionalism of many who were maintaining a standard in the Army, but also recognise it wasn't perfect. Conditions of service, the way some people were treated, it can always do better. And, the Army of that time, had its problems, but overall I had a very positive experience.
So you do a couple of years in artillery and then you post into 1RAR. What was that like for you? Do you have fond memories of 1RAR?
Yeah. And again, Adam, that sequence is right, with the exception that I went to Duntroon in the middle.
There you go. Yeah, right. Yeah. How was that for you?
So mid-94, at the sort of encouragement of my chain of command, Mark Watson, who was my artillery section commander, again, great guy, very good leader, he sort of encouraged me to apply for Duntroon. I was pretty agnostic about it, but I applied and thankfully got through the selection process. I'm pretty sure that my selection was contingent on my continuing representation in the Army football team. And again, I don't say that as a bad thing.
Yep.
It's just how the world worked back then. So having played Army footy didn't hurt.
What position did you play?
Well, it was a combination of rover, ruck rover, forward pocket. Army footy's great because, again, you can play in any position.
Yep.
Depends on whether you get 18 or if there's 16 turning up, you might be playing 3. But anyway, I went to Duntroon mid-94 and graduated end of 95. Again, Duntroon was a very positive experience for me. That foundation training as a soldier helped. The training system I thought was quite good. Again, Army wasn't perfect, but it was good enough.
Yep.
And that class that graduated at the end of 95 was a big class because, again, we're coming out of the recession in the mid-90s. So we had over 200 in our graduating class.
Yeah, right.
And I got my wish, thankfully, of going to infantry. Went and did my basic Regimental Officer Basic course at Singleton. Again, good course. And then was posted to 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment in Townsville and marching in there and immediately deploying on, I think it was exercise initial landing from memory, which was into Shoalwater Bay via HMAS Tobruk.
Yeah, right. And what was that like for you? Obviously, being just coming out of your officer training and leading now, what was that like for you going into an operation so quickly after graduating? Well,
I took myself very seriously as a young lieutenant. Again, I was quite young compared to others. So, when I went into Duntroon, I was 19. I was 20 when I got platoon command, and I just turned 21 in the February.
Yep.
I had a platoon of about 18. It was 12 platoon Delta Company 1RAR. The platoon was known as the toolbox platoon by others because apparently it was full of spanners, which is some sort of derogatory term, which I don't quite understand, but anyway. But I went into that command with, a challenge around that platoon in particular. But, within a month had realised that there was tremendous talent in that platoon, and it was just about being able to lead people, give them confidence and the ability to, imagine themselves as a better version of who they were at the time. So, we as a platoon went from, I think, second last in the platoon competition one year, and then we came second the second year, and then when I went to recon platoon, we won it the year after, with a lot of those guys that came with me. So it was a good platoon, 12 platoon, and the 3 years I had in platoon command in 1RAR, again, I reflect on as a highlight. It's been really interesting, even in the past sort of 2 years. The people that have reached out to me to make contact again, a lot of them have been soldiers from 1RAR, which is just fascinating in terms of it's been 25 odd years, and those connections still exist.
And for you, like, I've spoken to a lot of Special Force, so 2 Commando, which we'll get into shortly for you, and a lot of them came from 1RAR, a lot, and fond memories of people working alongside you, and Plater and a few others as well, and it just, I've heard that just good people came out of 1RAR.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, all the battalions have, soldiers of immense talent, but just in terms of my circle, so for example, in Recon Platoon 1RAR, which I had in 1998, and I'm sure many of your listeners will know these individuals. So I had Todd Langley.
Yep.
I had Weston Hennessy. I had Mick Sloman. I had, forgive me, I'm just trying to think of his name, Alex Tessereri, who was a seminal sniper and who was in reconnaissance and surveillance section, and he again was just outstanding, and people of that ilk. So of that platoon, I think in recon we had probably 25, and nearly 20 ended up serving special forces in different capacities, and they were all very capable, very independently minded individuals, which makes leadership a challenge when you're the platoon commander and everyone in your platoon can do your job better than you can. But that's okay. You've got to take that energy and you've got to turn it into something that you can effectively manage in the context of your own responsibilities. But that recon platoon was immensely talented, and those soldiers, many of whom went on to great things, and some who were tragically killed on operations, is just a reflection again of the quality of people we have in the army, and it's a real privilege to be associated with them.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned 1998, the talk of 4RAR standing up capability of being a commando, getting back to commando capability and a unit. When did you have a cycle from that you did a couple of years at 1RAR and then you had to move on and get more experience, and how did you end up going to 4RAR Commando?
Yeah. So my aim was to be a platoon commander for as long as I could, rather selfishly perhaps. So I did 3 years platoon command in 1RAR, and then I went to then the 4th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, which had just been given that commando role, I think at the end of 97 or 97, with the intention and hope of being able to extend my command time for as long as I could, because that battalion allowed captains to be platoon commanders. It effectively manned for that, and of course the other option was SASR, which was always an event horizon for me. But as events sort of transpired, the common selection course of 1999 was how I sort of came into the orbit of Special Forces in the main, and I went into that selection course with a pretty open mind. I was happy to serve in either unit, but 2/3 of the way through I made the deliberate choice to go to Commandos, just in terms of where I thought my best fit was, but recognising opportunities in both units. And again, I'm sure we'll get into this, but Special Forces has that opportunity to serve either as a commando or an SAS leader, either as an NCO or as an officer, and they lead you down different pathways, but many of the qualities and the skills and the attributes are quite similar, and I was lucky enough to be part of that experience. So having completed that course, having been successful, I then went back on another turn where I had another 4 years, I think it was, of platoon command. So I used to joke that I was a platoon commander longer than Australia's involvement in the Second World War, and I'm not comparing the two by any degree, but I was very lucky as a young officer to have, nearly six plus years of platoon command. And I worry about, young officers that go through platoon command in 6 months or 1 year, because it took me 2 years to know what I was doing, let alone actually then to apply it.
Yep.
And so that's that's a challenge going forward.
It's a great point you touch on, because I know it myself, I became a crew leader at 26 and a deputy captain, and for the first 2 years I really struggled. I really struggled to find my leadership style, how I led, and I lost the respect of my crew for a while there, because, like I said, well, you've seen me as a firefighter, and then my captain pulled me in at the time and said, you need to prove that you're a leader. You need to prove that you can be trusted and that they can put their life in your hands and you can get them. And as a young 26-year-old, that's very...
Yep.
You take that on and it is hard, but eventually the penny drops and you work it out. And great point you touch on there.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Adam, you meet people, I was lucky enough to meet Sir Francis Hassett as a cadet. He was a battalion commander at the end of the Second World War. He sort of got his command at the age of 24. So, and then you think about people through history like Alexander the Great and others. Now, they're born into those roles, so it's a different context. But age is certainly no barrier to talent, but experience and practice with knowledge sort of breeds wisdom.
Yep.
And I think people need to be given the opportunity to develop and cultivate that experience base in the first instance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for you, going into the 4-hour Commando, and we'll get into the name change later on in the podcast, was it exciting to see what the new capabilities were going to be for 4-hour at that time? Yeah,
there was a lot happening. So you had the raising of that capability. We had then the operational dimension to that. So there was, in very quick succession, the Interfet and East Timor series of operations, which again saw the unit have to sort of pivot to sustain a rotation, which happened in 2001. And again, I was lucky enough to deploy as a platoon commander, in this case up in Bobonaro, and in a place called Marco, which was the independent platoon just north of Maliana there. Again, that was a great experience, great opportunity to command on operations. And then we had the Sydney Olympics dimension, to where SOCOM had to generate 2 tactical assault groups, and 4RAR had a responsibility as part of that contingency as well. We had Operation Plum Bob, which was the services assisted evacuation of Australians and approved foreign nationals out of Honiara in and around that time as well. And so those 3 activities really spanned from 99 through to late 2000, early 2001. And then, of course, overlapping all of that, and it happened when we were in East Timor, was 9/11. And again, September 11, 2001, everyone who lived through that time knows where they were when they first heard about the Twin Towers. For me, it was being on a patrol looking down at the tactical control line, which was the pseudo border between East Timor and Indonesia, and having a Timorese local essentially, in rough English, talk about a plane hitting the White House. So we'd sort of, and this is all pre-internet, of course, so we didn't really have any communications with the outside world. And so we came back in, and half the unit was packing up in a hurry. It was in the middle of the handover with 2RR, and the world changed. So, 9/11 happened, and the focus for Special Forces certainly became operations in the context of global war on terror, but also things like standing up the second tag in 4RAR, which again, transformed that unit. So there was so much change, and from an operations perspective, priorities, and again, before the 20th century, priority could only ever be used in the singular. You only ever had one priority.
Yep.
Well, post 9/11, we had lots of priorities, and that made us all very busy.
So I just want to go back for a minute with your selection. So officer selection for 4RR, was it different to the men, or was it exactly the same? You went through exactly the same selection, and what do you remember of your selection, and how many started, and what was the hardest part of selection for you?
So it was a common selection. It was for both SASR and Commandos. There was probably close to 200 odd that were on that selection course. I think by the end of it, there might have been 50 or 60 left. And, it was the typical series of activities and, sort of induced pressures to be able to really measure somebody's suitability and, frankly, trainability. One of the key attributes, I think, is being able to quickly assimilate knowledge and demonstrate it in application, in a time pressure environment. I think, again, that's why Special Forces select, a particular sort of person. But Officer OR from a physical perspective was the same. There were additional tests for officers, which is appropriate. And it sort of, just thinking out loud, there were things like, we jumped in, a body of water and sort of swam around for 3 hours. And there were people that would literally, withdraw their volunteer status at that point, which is not a criticism of them. They just decided that they didn't like it, which, that's what the course is there for. It's to keep people safe by not asking them to do something, A, they wouldn't volunteer to do, but B, that they're not comfortable in doing. And so there was a whole series of activities. I mean, the normal sort of, I fully respect Olympians and elite sports people, but there is nothing more utterly exhausting in life than the 3.2 kilometre run in webbing and rifle in under 16 minutes. And it doesn't matter if you come first or if you come in at 15:59. It's a life-changing experience, even for good runners, because it's one of those tests that, in theory, it should be pretty easy to train for and pass. In practice, though, when you're pre-fatigued, which we were, and suddenly they throw this thing up at you, and it's not that perfect training environment that you've become accustomed to, and you've got to reach in and find the intestinal fortitude that is in most of us, but sometimes it's harder to sort of elicit. That thing is a gut punch, and it's a good filter. It's not the only determinant, but I think it's one of those, seminal moments in your life when you pass that course and you literally feel like you've won. You feel like Kathy Freeman. You feel like you've won the 400 metres at the Sydney Olympics.
So, for you, and I've spoken to a lot of operators that their time in Afghanistan, they could refer back to and draw back on selection and they said when they were tired and they've been in the fight, and that's, as they said to me, and what you've just said is that's what selection is. It is preparing you for that. Can you endure? Can you continually endure the hardship?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty reasonable. I'd agree with that. I mean, again, it's not specific to Special Forces. I think it's just recognising your responsibility and applying it in a certain context. So, when you're a platoon commander and you deploy in operations, you've got responsibility for 30 people. And it doesn't mean you have to come first every time, but you've got to be in the top 10, because there's an inspirational element to leadership. And so, for that particular cohort, there's a physical dimension to leadership, and when you're in operations where, again, you are asking people to do extraordinary things in the context of extreme risk, again, there is a leadership dimension to that which necessitates you being, at the moment of decision, sharing that risk and reassuring people that they have the trust and the confidence of yourself. And also they've been trained and they have the ability to execute that mission as planned. That's a big component.
Oh, absolutely. And for you, so you went on to the Rio cycle, and then what was it like to finally get your Green Beret?
Look, I was very proud. It was a significant achievement in my life. But also, that was the start of the responsibility. It's a little bit, again, I'm not conflating it, but I guess it's a bit like a cricketer the first time they get their baggy green to play for Australia. That's the start point, not the end point. And so very much, it was the same when I marched out of Kapuka. It was the same when I was commissioned as a lieutenant.
Mm-hmm.
It was the same when I was successful and was fully qualified as a commando. You know, it recognised a significant moment in your life, but also then what has to come next. And I think, again, in the leadership dimension of what we all do, because in the military, leadership's not a rank or an appointment. I think it's a virtue or a character that's expected of everyone, whether you're, number 3 rifleman or you're the platoon commander. You are expected to lead, and it's all about character, and it's about behaviour, and it's about professional application of knowledge, and that's incumbent on all of us. In SOCOM, it's very demanding, and there's a high level of expectation, and that's not unreasonable.
So you just mentioned that, as you say, number 3, so leadership is across the board. Working with multiple armies that you have around the world, do we do it different? Is it as you refer back to training? Do we have a higher emphasis on that than other countries around the world? Look,
I think, again, I wouldn't necessarily criticise others. I just think about what are our strengths, and this is a little bit army centric, but the same applies to a ship's company in the Navy and a wing or a squadron in the Air Force. Our army is world renowned for tactics, techniques and procedures really at the battle group and below. So you think about the Battle of Long Tan, you think about the Battle of Marion Sang, for example, from the Korean War is significant because it's the only honour on the Royal Australian Regiment colour that's an offensive action. The rest are defensive or they're theatre honours, and again, that's not a criticism, but I'd encourage people to go and look at Marion Sang as a planned and executed operation, and that subunit manoeuvres, that company level manoeuvre, and then sub-subunit, which is platoon. We have a well-earned reputation for being professional masters at that level. Now, it doesn't mean you can assume that's always the case, but I think that's what the Australian Army is especially famous for, and that's why places like Tully, where we do jungle training, and eminent people like Warrior George, who's again part of our sort of storied history of passing on those training and tactical techniques from the Vietnam War on one side through to Interfet on the other. That continuity piece, we're very good at that, and that's something that our training system, has to protect going forward, because in the context of our army, that's what I think gets us through most of the time.
So you mentioned that, so September 11 happened, and then did you, as being with standing up capabilities, and did you think, okay, we're going to war now, and there, it didn't quite go as quickly as we were in Afghanistan in 2005? Was that the Commandos were first in with the SAS back in 2005? Is that correct?
Yeah. So, the first of Australia's experiences in Afghanistan post 9/11 was clearly the SAS activity into FOB Rhino with the Marines, with General Mattis, and that was again significant achievement on the part of that squadron and its eventual move up to Kandahar. There was also the operations around Operation Anaconda, which was part of that hunt for Bin Laden, which again had significant involvement from SASR elements, and I absolutely pay tribute to those individuals who performed outstandingly well, really in pretty extreme circumstances. Great credit to everyone involved. And then for my own personal experience, Iraq and Operation Falconer came in the middle of all that. Now, I was the S3 or the OPSO of 4RR at the time, so we sent a contingent to Iraq. Everyone's well familiar with that activity from the west into Iraq proper. And again, a credit to all involved. Represented our country in very extreme circumstances, and I pay tribute to them and what they did. There was a commando element to that as well, and then we pivoted again back into regional operations, and then the Iraq commitment, the Afghanistan commitment in the form of rotation 1, if you like, started in that period. Now, for me, I was actually on UNSO, which is the United Nations Truce Supervisory Organisation contribution to various conflicts around Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt and Jordan.
Yep.
And, I deployed on that activity for 12 months and served in northern Israel, in Syria. I lived in Damascus for a long time and also had occasion to be in northern Lebanon. And I was there at a time of heightened tension. So I thought I was going on a peace operation. Within the first 3 weeks of being there, a French UNMO had been killed, and the towers along the blue line between Lebanon and northern Israel were coming under frequent and harassing attack from all protagonists in the middle of a shooting war between the IDF and Hezbollah, essentially. So that was a pretty significant, again, experience, and I learned a lot out of that. And then I came back to the unit, and then we're on the sort of run up to Afghanistan. Just for clarity, and I'm sorry, just to make it clear as well, in 2002 I also went to Bougainville for 6 months.
There you go. Yes.
So that wasn't an insignificant moment, and again I learned a lot on that deployment. Peace monitoring group, but in terms of regional dynamics, the history of the Revolutionary War, if you like, on Bougainville proper, between the BRF, which was the Papuan-backed, Bougainvillean resistance force, and the BRA, which is the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. There was a dynamic of the PNGDF and its involvement, the RPNGC, which is the constabulary, and our role, which was to really bring into effect a disarmament and a demobilisation of all combatants, meeting some significant individuals. Ismail Tarama was one of them, who was a key sort of lieutenant in the BRA. Again, none of these people are perfect, but he was an inspirational leader in his own right.
Yep.
And I'd also encourage Australians to learn more about that conflict. That issue hasn't gone away. We're moving into a period where the Bougainvilleans will sort of decide their future in and around 2027, and all stakeholders in that particular conflict need our support. So yeah.
And before we get into you deploying to Afghanistan, you were involved in another, it was in the Southwest Pacific evacuation called Operation Quickstep.
Yeah.
And where 2 Australian soldiers were killed. How did that affect you? Because was that the first time that you'd been involved with deaths on an operation?
No, because we had, and just sort of, again, coming left, sorry.
Yeah, no,
in amongst all that, we had the East Timor intervention as well.
Yep.
So to get the sequence,
I guess
I'll just clarify.
Yeah, please do.
So we did Operation Plum Bob in the Solomons in the 2000s. Yep. We did Operation Tanager, which was 6-7 months in East Timor in 2001. Bougainville was 2002. Operation Tartan, which was the recovery of the merchant vessel Pong Su, was 2003. That coincided, that was Easter, Good Friday through to Easter Sunday 2003. That coincided with my role as the battalion OPSO during Operation Falconer. Now, I didn't deploy to Iraq, but we force generated it. That was 03. And then 04 was my time as an ADC to Duncan Lewis, which was fascinating, and he's an inspirational leader and a great Australian. 2005 was UNTSO, so that was the 12 months in the Middle East.
Yep.
And then 2006 I came back into 4RAR. Mark Smethurst was the CO, and I deployed on Operation Astute, which was into East Timor, which is after the Renado insurrection and the sort of ructions of government in East Timor, and that's probably a story in and of itself, but I won't waste people's time here. And then got back from that, and then 3 weeks later we deployed an Operation Quickstep, which is what you're referring to, which we'll talk about, and then into 2007 we're then into rotation 4 for Afghanistan to go back in. So in that sort of 4-year period, I think, the better part of more than 3 years was continually deployed on, a variety of operations. So that was a pretty distinct experience. And I mean, the thing I like, and I was very fortunate, is that most, if not all of those activities, I was in command. So in command of soldiers. So it wasn't the case. And I have no disrespect to anyone who deploys in their role, whether you're a operations clerk or you're a staff officer, I mean, you all should be respected and honoured in terms of your own contribution. But for me, being in command of soldiers, with a rule of engagement, with a mission, with an element of risk to manage, that's what I joined the Army for.
Yep.
And I was just blessed to be given that 5, 6, 7, 8 opportunities in that very short time period. And this is before, the sort of hot war, which sort of kicks off in earnest in 07. So,
yeah.
But just coming back to Quickstep, that incident and the loss of Josh Porter and Mark Bingley, I mean, sort of standing on the flight deck and bearing witness to that in slow and quick time was clearly a tragedy for everyone involved, devastating for the families. Josh Porter was somebody I knew who had previously served in battalions I'd served in before he did selection.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew Mark Bingley because he's ex-1RAR. He was in snipers before he went and did the pilot and flying scheme. So I knew Mark from my time in Delta Company. He was a corporal then. So again, another tragedy. The aviation squadron that deployed on Quickstep with me was also the aviation squadron we took into Timor on Astute. So I knew the squadron commander, I knew the troop commanders, I knew the loadies. So we're all pretty tight. And it was a real tragedy. I mean, it was devastating. But the actions of those on the day, there were, personnel who went in with that aircraft, who, got themselves out of the aircraft, and as they're sort of surfacing, hit the bottom of the LPA, had to navigate around, literally, keel haul style, to come up the other side and effect a self-rescue. But, it was a tragedy for all involved. But again, in those moments, you see leaders and soldiers performing beyond their minimum obligation, and when you reflect on that, it's inspirational.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned 06, 07 for rotation 4 into Afghanistan, and you deployed with the Commando company group. And what was the Commando's role in this early stages of 06, 07?
So I went in, I think we did the recon, and then went in around, I'm guessing now, I think it was April 07. And what was different was rotations 1, 2 and 3 were Commando force elements that were not fully formed company groups. So we took a full company group in 07, which means we had manoeuvre, suppression or firepower systems and the command and control systems to be able to independently deploy and operate, in the deep sort of part of the battle space. So 27 odd SRVs, the special reconnaissance vehicles, a couple of motherships, which were the souped up Unimogs with armour and 84 ammunition. And, the company looked like a combination of the long-range desert group of the Second World War and a, episode of Mad Max. So we got all our vehicles in, and then started to plan a series of operations in the deep battle space to effectively disrupt insurgent movement of lethal aid up the Helmand River Valley and then through Khazaristan province to the north, which was known as the Taliban highway. I think it was called the Taliban jet stream, where they'd come in through Khazaristan, come down through Uruzgan province and Zabul, hit Highway 1, turn left and go straight up to Kabul. So that's where they sort of come for fighting season. So we were our role was to sit in the middle of it and disrupt that. So, we had the capacity to create dilemmas insofar as we had mass compared to other force elements. So it wasn't unsophisticated in its operational design. It wasn't, a occasion to drive up a valley and see what was going to happen. It was never that. It was always intelligence led. But certainly in terms of independent command, having 27 vehicles and essentially an empty battle space that's being supported by high level intelligence was again, a great privilege but a great responsibility. So, and our tactics were very much focused on disruptions. So that meant effectively Zulu mustering as platoons and occasionally as a company in an area, and then doing long walk-ins. So we would do most of our deliberate operations at night. In fact, I think we did all of them. And this was in the period of the controversies around, night operations, and Karzai had put out his requirements. So the idea was to infiltrate at night and to, conduct the activity itself in the daylight, consistent with those requirements. And so, long walk-ins, pretty kinetic, which was not the design, but that was just the nature of the operating environment. And, I think overall we contributed to, breaking up lethal aid networks, distributing and denying key leaders access, which was the shadow government. And effectively it was about keeping people safe. So, our operations weren't in and of themselves, internally focused. They were about keeping Australians safe. The aim was to keep lethal aid, and by that I mean components and experts that can build improvised explosive devices to put on roads and to kill civilians and other Australians, and to prevent that distribution in the Uruzgan province. And so, that was our essential task.
So in rotation 4, was the IED threat as prevalent as it was in later deployments?
It got more sophisticated and more challenging. So we evolved away from SRVs and those sorts of vehicles purely because of the nature of that threat. When I was there in 2007 on rotation 4, it wasn't that... it could be managed. So, we could safely, to the degree in which you can do anything safely in Afghanistan, navigate that threat, but it had changed. So Poppy Pierce was killed in the back end of my rotation, which was an IED on an overwatch position above the 1 Hour Bridge. And then, of course, the Special Operations Task Group had a number of deaths, and it became clear to everyone that methodology was no longer appropriate in the context of the operating environment. And then you see, as time evolves, the shift to helicopter-borne disruption activities, and part of that was because of that threat.
So Luke Worsley was the first commando killed. How was his death on the regiment, and how is that on you personally?
So I'd left and handed over when Luke was killed. He was killed as part of the Bravo Company contingent, which we handed over to. Look, I think, again, every death's a tragedy. I mean, there was definitely, a feeling of grief, but also a sobering reality that these things are not inevitable, but in terms of risk calculation, it becomes a factor. So you do everything you can in your operational planning to reduce risk and to keep people safe. I always thought, with the exception of fellow comrades, there's not much worth dying for in Afghanistan, frankly. With the exception of your mates, in terms of managing risk. And so you try and manage it down to as low as possible, recognising that you can't manage it away. So you've got to think about it in that context. But certainly Luke Worsley was a loss, genuine loss. He was a great soldier, and highly respected. And he died, serving his country. So with that as a sort of sobering reality, we sort of moved through 2007 and then into the, really the more intense parts of those rotations.
Into the kinetic. And I had I've interviewed a couple of former operators who were there on that night, and remember carrying Luke, and as you say, over arduous terrain to bring his body back out. And I remember asking one of the operators, and he just said it was what you did. You were bringing a mate, and like you said, you were fighting alongside your mates. That's what you were fighting for.
Yep, 100%. I mean, we had Pro 1 casualty on our trip where, I had a moment after he'd been evacuated where, we've got platoon in heavy contact, another platoon in contact. My CQ is trying to recover ammunition which had been parachuted in and has sort of drifted down to the bottom of a valley floor. He blew the transfer case on his vehicle.
Yeah, right.
And we've got an AC-130 gunship checking in because we're being routed to a flank. And I just have these moments of clarity and I soon go, well, this is what it is. This is war, right?
Mm.
So, you yourself... And then you start hearing this whistle of a mortar that's in the air and it's going to land somewhere and there's nothing you can do about it.
Mm.
So, you sit here listening and you hear this... And,
You hope it doesn't hit you.
Just thinking, well, there's nothing I can do about this other than try and keep people safe by communicating, talking about the threat and letting people take action. But, the privilege I had was that my platoon commanders were just outstanding, far more capable in the context of their responsibilities than I was. And the soldiers were brilliant, and that's what helps you manage that complexity. And your role is just to bring clarity and, calm, focused direction in the context of those emergencies.
So you come back from Afghanistan, and what's happening in and around the unit in 2008?
So certainly getting back from that rotation sort of was the end of my time as a company commander, which again I count as one of the highlights of my career. I had concluded my time, was moved into the Regimental Executive Officer position for the handover takeover between Mark Smethurst and Paul Kenny. At that same time, there were obviously ongoing contributions into Afghanistan, which we were focused on. But also, you could see that as the unit matured and became more renowned for its pedigree, that there was a lot of motivation around thinking about how the regiment should be classified in the context of the history of commandos and special forces in the historical sense, but also how best to describe the capability moving forward. And certainly with the requirements of supporting those operations in that theatre, as well as ongoing very short notice response options for counter-terrorism and other strategic missions, thinking about how the unit brands and benchmarks and describes itself is really important, both for attracting and retaining our people to serve in those very demanding roles, but also in the historical context, how we define ourselves, how we pay tribute to those that have served before, and how we think about preserving their memory and their contribution more broadly. But as it turned out, with the incoming CO and with the operational tempo as it was, by December 2008, I was back in Afghanistan again. Having been asked to go and help establish the NATO Special Operations Coordination Centre, which eventually became ISAF Special Operations Forces in latter iterations in around 2012, 2013. So back into Mons, which is where the headquarters was in France, Belgium. Did some planning with key allies in that regard, and then back into Kabul to stand up that headquarters and really take Special Forces, which was quite disaggregate in its command and control and its mission context in Afghanistan, and really try to unify it through reorganisation of command and control. And I mean, for those that follow these things, Admiral Bill McRaven is a legend and a thoroughly decent person, and it was a great honour to work for and with him, and just bear witness to what genius looks like, in my view, when it comes to modern day military professionals. So I did that for a few months, came back to the unit in sort of around mid-08, into that XO role under Paul Kenny proper, and as you sort of indicate, there was now momentum, and thanks very much to Paul Kenny's leadership in many respects, towards thinking about how to put 4RAR Commando into a context where a rename to the 2nd Commando Regiment seemed appropriate in both the historical context as it allied itself to the 1st Commando Regiment in Special Operations Command, so you would neaten that up. But also, I think just as critically, how to really pay tribute to that period from 1996 through to 2008, where those that served in Special Forces under the aegis of 4RAR Commando could be appropriately acknowledged, and that name change seen as a natural extension of the journey of turning that unit from what it was into what it needed to become, which in the 2 Commando Regiment form it eventually was allowed to do that. And that was all to do with the leadership of people like the Chief of Army, General Gillespie, and others, that it's a process to change an Army unit and its name. Customs and traditions are really important. There are people who are invested and their families. That Unit 4RAR has got a wonderful history of claret operations during the confrontation, which is part of the Special Forces pedigree in a historical sense. Its service in Vietnam, its service in East Timor in 2001, and then the early days of Afghanistan, where again, proudly, members of that unit wore the Royal Australian Regiment badge, served in Special Forces, but were part of the Infantry Corps, and that was really important to preserve that contribution in an appropriate way. And I'm really pleased that that happened in the way that the unit evolved its name over that period, which took a long time. It wasn't over and done with by 2008. Certainly when I left to go to Marine Corps Commander Staff College, that process and its result was not yet known, and it was uncertain because there was a lot of really well qualified reasons not to do it, and yet there was a really compelling narrative to do it. And again, over the 18 months that followed, it got to a point where the unit name change was effected. And I think, historically now and on reflection, people would agree it was the right thing to do, and it was done respectfully. It was done in acknowledgement of the unit's history, and it was done with an eye on the future, and I think it's proven itself very worthwhile.
So who was you mentioned that the history, and you mentioned, was there a few names thrown up of how the regiment would come, and the design of the unit badge, and how did that all come about, Ian?
Yeah, really interesting. I wasn't necessarily in the regiment when that discourse was underway, but as part of the broader community I featured. One of the really nice things is that the fellow who designed what was finally agreed to as the unit hat badge, the crest if you like, the motto, was a serving commando who for him tragically was severely injured in the helicopter crash of 2010. And I won't name him because I don't have his permission, but he knows who he is, and those that matter also know. But he was a graphic design artist. He deployed with me to East Timor to those contingency operations off Fiji in 2006, and into East Timor again in Afghanistan in 2007. So I knew him very well. And he took and was inspired from the M and Z Special, second, first independent companies, which became the Northern Australia Reserve Unit, which became Norforce, took those double diamonds, projected them in the context of what the 2nd Commando Regiment best represents in terms of history, but also pedigree going forward, and it ended up being the successful design. So full credit to that individual, full credit to the leadership for enabling that, and it's a really nice historical footnote to what eventually became, the unit's hat badge, which is proudly worn today.
And for you and the other boys in the regiment, how was it perceived? Was it a good transition, and the boys really incorporated the new design and the new way of the unit was going?
Very much so. So, and again, I'll slightly qualify, boys and girls.
Sorry, yeah, boys and girls. Sorry, yep.
Very important part of the capability. But the regiment itself, I think was really strengthened by the confidence that came with the name change and that expression of support that came from the Chief of Army down. And, for a unit that's suffering casualties, that is suffering loss, that is dealing with the very real and visceral experiences of warfare, those things really matter. They really matter. You've only got to talk to veterans when they relate their own service to understand, these are the intrinsic motivations that form friendships and bonds, and why units are so important. We used to call it the regimental system, which is where your regiment is the most important organisation you identify with. You join the army, but you serve your regiment, or your battalion or what have you. And then that becomes even more intense when you break it down to company and platoon. But, as a protective factor, as, a really foundational component of how you describe yourself, being in a regiment that you identify with is critical. And it's history has borne that out. And I think in 2 Commando's case, it was only enhanced by that name change and all of the benefits that came with it.
And I think great point you touch on there is, as you say, if you go back in history and you look at the First World War, you look at the Second World War, the battalion was the family. That was what they weren't fighting for king or country or queen. It was they're fighting for their mates, alongside their mates. And you're exactly right that I think if in any military or first responder, you're fighting alongside your mates. That's why you do it, and you know that yourself because you've been in combat and you know exactly that's what you do it for. It's not for anything else other than the mate beside you.
Yeah, I think the idealism of why you're there and what you're doing is always important, but the lived experience is very much about not letting people down. So it's about those on your left and those on your right. You want to have a shared experience. You want to share danger in a way that's pretty democratic. You need to sort of, I think about that as a leader, and that's not necessarily reflective of the rank you wear or the position you hold, but it's how you want to contribute overall to the group, to the organisation.
There you go. We're back. Yes, and so for you, what was happening in 2010 for you? Because you stepped away from the regiment at that point.
Yep.
What was happening in 2010 for you?
So I was posted away to US Marine Corps Commander Staff College. I did the first year there and then the second year at the School of Advanced Warfighting. I came back in mid-2010 early to be the acting commanding officer in the absence of the posted incumbent who had deployed to Afghanistan. In the week that I came back was the 21 June helicopter crash.
How was that for you, and coming back and knowing those guys? If you can share with us how that affected you.
Yeah, I mean, I knew all of those affected individuals particularly well. Obviously upsetting and distressing for all the reasons you'd understand.
Yep.
Dealing with the immediate aftermath, and particularly given the amount of people injured and others that were obviously impacted as well. So there's always the challenge of dealing with trauma and shock, and that includes how best to gather around families. But then the very real challenges of managing the wounded that had come back in a hurry and moving them through Landstuhl in Germany, back into Richmond, and then out to a hospital in Western Sydney, and then the intense management of people who, several were not expected to live in the sort of week post-crash, post-evacuation. And as the CO, I mean, you find yourself in and under all sorts of pressures and obligations, and that's part of the job. But it's not a week. I mean, that's 6 months, 7 months. In the long-term context, it's still going. But in that role, at one point we're out at the hospital twice a day, and we're running a regiment, and we're doing essentially battlefield reinforcements, sending people back into theatre, and we're doing the next rotation in terms of training them up to certify. And the Army and Defence at that point had little experience in dealing with mass casualty trauma and management. So, whether it's fair or unfair, the regiment was sort of, given the requirement to generate all of these systems of support in a pretty policy-free environment. So that, again, came with all sorts of challenges that aren't written down anywhere, but invariably have to deal with. And
as you mentioned there, the Army hadn't really had mass casualties since Vietnam, had they? Like, this was on the context that it was and how guys were being injured. It was really not since Vietnam that we'd experienced these type of casualties and in the field casualties.
Yeah, I mean, we'd had the 96 Black Hawk tragedy. I mean, that's peacetime. No different in terms of scale and loss. But you're dead right. It's something that we hadn't experienced as a military for a long time, which is a good thing.
Yep.
But the nature of war and conflict is that tragically these things will happen, so you need to hope for the best and plan for the worst. And so, getting policy to line up from everything from, providing support to families, being able to make decisions around resourcing and where care stops and starts, the interface with DVA, where we can provide additional care to families, and we're talking about people who are in hospital for 8 months. So how do you fly a family from Darwin and then put them up at a hospital and a hotel nearby where they're going to be there every day for 8 months? And what's the obligation in terms of support? And I can tell you the obligation is that, through the service, we have an obligation to protect the interests of our members and their families. And, this is a different experience. We don't have a Walter Reed or a Bethesda medical centre like they do in the US. So in that respect, it was very challenging. I mean, again, I'm not critical of the system more broadly because people were all trying to do the right thing by those impacted, but invariably, when the music stops and everyone else has got a chair, as a commander, you've got to make decisions. And that's what needed to happen. So, yeah.
So you mentioned in 2000, so that happens, you come back to the unit, and then in 2011 you deploy again to Afghanistan as serving as the plans officer at the Special Operations HQ. Without going into too much detail, what was your role and how was this different to your 2010 when you were back over there, and how had the war been progressing to this point when you were over there from 2007?
Yep, so 2011 I was in and out a fair bit.
Yep.
My role as the plans officer was in the context of SOCOM, and so we were doing campaign planning from Australia, so we were certainly very much focused on Afghanistan, but sort of moving in and out of theatre and, really talking to both the national command element but also, the coalition to get the settings right for how we were going to conduct the campaign. And, many people would know that an operation is in the context of a campaign, which in this case can last years and years, and this was about generating sustainable options to be able to do that, as well as do everything else. So 2011 was very much that period leading up to the Obama surge, and so the US had a troop surge on. There was very much a push to get special operations into theatre as a way to, effectively hedge the conventional forces that were really busy on generating capacity inside the Afghan National Security Forces. So our role was to disrupt, in many respects, the insurgency's ability to undermine what the coalition was doing in terms of building national power and security forces that could obviously, be hoped to take over, thereby facilitating the international withdrawal. Tragically, it didn't quite turn out that way. But it's pretty dynamic because you've got the interests of our country, you've got the interests of Afghanistan and the people's requirement, rather, justifiably for basic levels of security. You then got the international coalition, and every country has its own interests at play. I would contend that inside the international system you don't have friends, you only have interests, and that plays out when you're doing flags to post and troop allocations and treaty obligations and what that all means in terms of our enduring commitment to a theatre of war. And, again, by 2011, that's 10 years in Afghanistan, in and out. But certainly it's starting to become our longest war in terms of time and commitment, and it's also becoming more difficult to measure success and value, and the purpose and the reason by which we were there is also becoming less clear and more challenging to define. So you've got a parliamentary debate happening back here which is pretty much inconclusive. You've got people quite rightly wondering when all of this investment is going to start to translate into an outcome that will precipitate and justify a withdrawal. We're focused really on the delivery of democratic systems that aren't historically known to survive or do well in that part of the world. So democracy is a bit of a foreign object that people are still trying to get their head around. And with some of those elections and the facilitation of those elections, it's a foreign process. And that's very difficult to do, and historically we've never done it well, and tragically, and 2021 will confirm this, we didn't do it well in that case either. But nonetheless, it was with the right intention. It was just, difficult in execution. But as a plans officer trying to develop a campaign, you've got all of that admixture of complexity, and your role is to produce clarity around mission, around execution, and to be able to give people a sense of confidence that you are designing operations that rely on their tactics and their application of those skills to produce something that is of benefit to the mission overall. It's not putting people in harm's way for the sake of it. It's doing it for a cause that is, right, sometimes righteous, and there's a difference between the two, but also necessary. Because, as a soldier, the one thing that I object to is putting people at risk unless it's done for the right reasons. And doing it for the sake of doing it is unjustifiable in my view. There must always be a purpose as to why we're putting people in harm's way.
So you mentioned that in 2011, 2012, the war was changing a lot, and there was a lot of works that the regiment was doing with the DEA, working alongside the DEA. And for people who aren't aware, Ian, can you give the listener a little bit of a background of what was happening at that point in time of what was happening with the terrorists were using drugs to aid their fight, but can you just give a little bit of background about that and what the role was?
So around that time, the government directed the task force to start to think about how we might be able to affect the insurgency's capacity to effectively, make war. I'm oversimplifying, but it's to deny them the resources to be able to hurt Afghan citizens and harm Australians in Uruzgan province. Part of that, I think, was an understanding that if we could disrupt what became known as the lethal aid network, which would be to disrupt their ability to earn income, to buy weapons effectively, and part of that was in interfering in the narcotics trade, but also to deny them the ability to import-export that lethal aid into and out of Uruzgan, then that would be a good thing. And a way to do that would be to partner with other US security agencies and assist them and their Afghan partners in the interdiction of narcotics as it related to the lethal aid network in the context of that armed insurgency. So this was not about being a police force. This was not about countering drug smuggling. This was about stopping the insurgency by denying it a principal resource. And so our role was effectively to set conditions for the National Interdictions Unit and its US partner, the DEA, to be able to do warrant-based interdiction operations in areas that were heavily contested and denied through military force. So, areas on the fringes of Uruzgan and effectively were strongholds for the Talibs and some of their proxies. So to get in there, you would need to organise a full mission profile where you're talking about having, close air support on station. You're setting conditions to effectively break in, enable the mission, and then to get out. And so our role was to enable that by bringing, special operations effects and military fighting power to that problem. So
with that, when you first went there in 2007, With the Taliban, they had a stance on drugs back then, or what was, because that obviously changed as the war went on, and is it, as you mentioned, that that was their funding for their weapons, and is that why so you did notice a big change as the war went on?
Well, ideologically, the Talibs had sort of eradicated poppy and that entire illicit system when they held government in the lead up to 2001. So you're right, philosophically they had no interest in any of that, but rather pragmatically over time, I think, as they saw it as a way to be able to generate the kind of capacity again to make war on the coalition, that's their interest shift in that regard. So it was less about their philosophical stance and more about this became a really convenient way to make money. And so they saw benefit and made excuse to do that. So,
and hence they need to keep funding their fight against the coalition forces. So that's the way to go about it and do it. And so In 2012 to 2015, you managed and led 500 Special Forces personnel, which included all the Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. And for you, what was it like commanding in this role and having so many people underneath you, and what challenges did you face?
It was always a privilege. I was always humbled and amazed by the sheer talent of our people, and it can be seen as a bit of a, empty rhetoric that people are our greatest asset, but it's absolutely true. So there's no question in my mind that, it was the greatest privilege in uniform service that I've ever had, is to command both the 2nd Commando Regiment on a couple of occasions, but also, special operations task groups in multiple theatres, and also, subunits, commando company groups in, again, multiple theatres. So my, on reflection, my great privilege was to be around those men and women and just bear witness to just how impressive and how wonderful they represent our nation in the uniform. But, having said all that as well, being given the opportunity to task organise and deploy as a formed military unit to effectively execute roles and missions at the highest end of capability, which, I'm conscious is not an opportunity afforded to many. So it was always a privilege, and being able to use all of those martial skills, be able to use the kind of technology and theatre setting missions that we could do in, Afghanistan in 2007, in Iraq in 2014-15, was every soldier's dream. So I'm sort of randomising here, but the privilege of leading great people, the honour of sort of bearing witness to just how impressive they were, and the most professional things I have seen in any form of military service relate to watching those with the tradecraft perform their roles. So it's everything from watching a Special Forces patrol assemble an inflatable boat to go on a pallet, to be rigged to a parachute, to be rolled out the back of a C-130 on a dark and mysterious night somewhere over the ocean, to be inserted into that water, to deploy and assemble that watercraft, to then do a 20-25 nautical mile transit, to then be able to move across the littoral threshold onto land, to conduct a mission, to recover back to that boat and then move 10 nautical mile to an extraction, all as a single mission profile. I mean, it is from execution to mission complete. It is the most systemised, professionally conceived, perfectly executed, artistic expression of men and women in the military context that I can think of. I mean, it's just amazing. And I think we don't often put enough faith in just how wonderfully trained and capable our people are until you see them do that. And that's what gives you the confidence to be able to make command decision around high-risk activities where in your mind you can de-risk it to a point of acceptability based on that human talent and that capital and the trust that exists between you and them that they can do their job to the standard required.
So you mentioned, when you got to the 2nd Commando Regiment as a 4RR originally Commando, now the 2nd Commando Regiment, when you first got there, did you foresee that the unit would get to the capabilities that it got to, and in such a short time? No,
I had high expectations, but they were exceeded. And particularly when so in 2007, it was pretty agricultural, our capabilities, when I compare it to sort of 12, 13, which is, it's the equivalent of Yuri Gagarin, sort of cutting laps around the Earth as the first sort of person to do so, and what we're seeing now as part of the future US Constellation missions. That's the difference. It's from analogue to digital. It's profound in terms of the technology uplift, but also just the trust and confidence that comes with better training, better equipment, and more professional, hard and focused on martial skills. And, frankly, 10 years of warfighting will do that. There's nothing that concentrates the mind more than, dealing with, those sorts of threats. So the CT role from 2001 onwards, the hardening of the regiment through its wartime experience, the really important focus of its missions, and the dependency that government and others had on it to be able to do its job, meant that we created what I think is one of the premier special forces units in the world, and it demonstrates the strength of our training system in the army, and the fact that we can scale and generate humans of that quality, but also just going forward, the confidence we can all have that unit and other special forces unit, and the Army and ADF more broadly, is a talented organisation. And if our people are well led, and they've got confidence in the equipment they have, and they've got purpose in the mission they're doing, then they will always achieve what we require them to do in the manner in which we need them to do it. It's about having faith in people, trust in their equipment, and allowing them to be the best version that they can be.
So you mentioned that you had the high expectations, but everyone who came to that regiment, did they just want to be part of it and keep progressing that capability forward to be the best that it could be?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's to sort of paraphrase the old sort of Napoleonic quote, morale, it has a compounding combat power effect of times 10. It's 10 is to 1. It's the essential element. If you don't believe in what you're doing, if you don't have the trust and confidence of your superiors, if you don't have faith in those around you that they can, provide you the safety that you need to do your job, and you also, respond in kind, then why would you accept risk? Why would you do this if it's not in your interests? And yet, courage is one of those things that we tend to remind ourselves and celebrate acts of physical courage, but moral courage is actually more important. And moral courage comes with the obligation to look after each other, and in discharging your own roles and missions, looking after yourself. It's about taking that next step to stand on the line and hold yourself accountable and be there when it matters. And, it's not about the dilemma of having to be brave or make a decision. That moment will come, and it manifests in all sorts of different ways. But it's about having the moral courage to be counted so that you can be depended on, and that people can trust you, and that they have confidence that you will be there when it matters.
I think most operators that I've spoken to, Ian, said the same thing, that they said we knew the risks, we knew what we were going to do, and if you didn't accept those risks, well, most of them have said you shouldn't be there. They accepted that. They knew what they were going into. So I understand what you mean by that. They know exactly what they're getting into, and they're willing to take that and lay down their life for, as you say, the morale, the courage, what they and the purpose of what they're fighting for.
And risk is always a factor. So I would never sit comfortably with an assumption around a mission profile that was high risk. And in the way you've described it, I understand exactly what you're talking about. But the role of the commander is to de-risk it. So you've got to reduce risk to mission, and you've got to reduce risk to force. That's about keeping people safe. And you do that through good planning. You do it through, good decision making. And you do it through an active and almost aggressive approach to reduce risk to as low as possible. So that might mean you could do, let's think about helicopter assault force insertion into a hostile area. So you would use intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance and other ways of understanding the battle space to give you the kind of certainty on the given day that you would know as much as you could about that battle space to reduce the risk of that helicopter assault force as it inserts. So you're not going in blind, you've de-risked it. Okay. you're going to have the ability to extract anyone who is wounded, injured or ill by having a really robust medical plan that might preposition aeromedical evacuation capability on a helo lily pad forward in the theatre, so it's 2 minutes away rather than an hour away. So if anyone gets hurt, you're there in 2 minutes. That's how you de-risk these missions, and this is the essential role of commanders, not only in special operations, but in military operations more broadly. It's about how you manage risk, and your role is not to accept high risk; it's to de-risk it. Doesn't mean risk has gone away, and making risk count in the context of decision making is really important. So you can't wish it away, but you've got to do everything humanly possible to reduce it to a point where you can keep your people safe to the degree in which you can. And that's the moral courage dimension to commander leadership in the execution of decisions around mission profiles.
So, people who aren't aware, Ian, how many rotations did the 2nd Commando Regiment do, and how, on average, how long was a deployment?
So they did all of them, to make a really simple observation. So 20 rotations, I think, is the sort of number. And there was a commando force element. I beg your pardon, the first two were SAS, which is the FOB Rhino insert in 2001. And then then there was the sort of 18-month break, and then rotation 1 in the sort of modern parlance begins with those forces going into theatre in 2000 and I think it was 2005. 4-5. That's rotation 1. But prior to that, we've got a couple of SAS squadrons that rotate through as part of the original Enduring Freedom contribution in 2001, 2002. So from rotation 1 onwards, there's an SAS, a commando, and a special operations engineer component to every rotation going forward. The length of rotation sort of waxes and wanes between 4 months and 6+ months. I mean, some individuals were there for quite long. I mean, my tenure as the CO in 2012-13, I think I was there for 8, so it's quite a long stint as a CO. I think that's right. But it was. And then the other important dynamic to this is that just because you're not in Afghanistan doesn't mean you're not thinking about it. So, it became a feature of your life. And I think some people would do well to remind themselves when they try and understand experience. Some people did one rotation, and that's to them how they define their wartime experience. And that's correct. Some people did, multiple, 6, 7, 8 rotations. And so their experience is much more broad in context, and it has it's almost like different seasons. Okay? But if you're in that regiment, and I got there in 98 and sort of in and out a couple of times, but left in 2015 as CO. Across that timescale, you're always thinking about operations. And in the Afghanistan context, you're always thinking about Afghanistan. It's never far away. I could tell you, whenever we had anyone killed and I was here, I could tell you exactly where I was standing when I found out when that happened. Exactly. I can remember the moment, And so if you're not in theatre, you're thinking about it. So you're either there, you're getting ready to go, you've just come back, or you're thinking about it. And so that's where it becomes a whole of life experience. And, this is the blessing and the curse of being a professional soldier. It's what
you sign up for, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
That's what you sign up for.
It doesn't make us victims. It's not a negative comment, but I think it's important to understand that. You're writing about the theatre, thinking about it all the time. It never goes away. And, in the context of all volunteer service, it is life-defining. So now whether that presents risk in terms of how you move past that, I think that's a genuine question, and there are risk factors there. But, you talk to people and, they've experienced the highs and lows of those operational deployments. And they'll tell you that the best time and the worst time in their life was in that country, which says odd for those that don't share that experience. But I mean, I'm entirely sympathetic to that view, and when they say that, I get what they mean. Yeah.
And so, how had you mentioned that the regiment had done 20 rotations. How had the fighting changed and the commando role changed from 2005 to 2014?
Yeah, so the mission kept evolving the whole way through. Sorry. Hey, how you going? Sorry, mate.
No, you're right.
Yeah. So the mission evolved. It sort of began with certainly a focus on enabling Special Forces patrols to be able to access the upper reaches of our areas of operation and provide that strategic reconnaissance and early effect in terms of disruption. So there's a lot of linkage to air power, terminal guidance, and again, really trying to deny the Taliban access to those heavily urban populated areas so that then security forces could move in, provide essential aid, and then bring safety and security to the people of Afghanistan. As the Australian commitment increased over time, so did the Special Forces component. Between 05 and 07, they were working to essentially a US headquarters. From 07 onwards, we started working increasingly to the regional command, so the geographic commander out of Kandahar.
Mm-hmm.
And by virtue of that, we became very focused on, his mission in terms of how we could service some of the deep parts of the battle space to, bring safety and security to things like the elections in 2010, the essential of the provision of essential services, aid, medical and others throughout 11-12, but then there's a disruption component to it as well. So that is intelligence-led disruption operations aimed at, essentially breaking up networks.
Yep.
And where appropriate, targeting individuals. So, yeah.
You served with some pretty outstanding men and women in the 2 Commando Regiment, and some of those were tragically killed. Todd Langley, who you served with in 1 RAR, and also Brett Wood and Cameron Baird, VCMG. What are some of your memories of Todd and Brett? And we'll get into Cam shortly, but what are some of your memories of Todd and serving with Brett? Yeah,
so I served with so many people and had that great privilege. And as it turned out, my time particularly in Recon Platoon in 1 RAR and in Delta Company in 1 RAR coincided with many, many soldiers who went on to great service in SASR and 2 Commando and other parts of the Defence Force. But in relation to Todd in the first instance, so I knew him since effectively the end of 1995. He was about 18 months, I think 2 years behind me in terms of the selection and reinforcement cycle. He was a wonderful human being and he was a great soldier. I mean, in terms of, again, martial skills, he would be, certainly in my experience, one of our finest. Very quiet, studious individual, had a real intellect about him, was a black belt in several forms of martial arts.
Yeah, right.
He would surprise people because physically he'd present himself as quite unassuming and then could literally turn himself into a pretzel, which was always impressive. Intellectual soldier in the sense that he took his tradecraft seriously. And somebody who I think, having deployed to Afghanistan as part of Rotation 3 from memory, had a very kinetic experience on that rotation, became really focused on performing in those sorts of operational conditions, and then that is what bred his reputation. There was an acronym, TIC, which was Troops in Contact, which many of your listeners would be aware to. Well, that was appropriated to Todd in Contact because on Rotation 4, he was what I would describe as sort of one of the lead call signs in terms of our reconnaissance and sort of pathfinding push into the deep parts of the province, which invariably meant that he would find and locate hostile forces earlier than most. And so Todd in Contact became a program which he became quite famous for. And again, the tragedy of losing him was deeply felt. I think, his memory justifiably should be based on a great family man, but also his martial skills were just excellent. He was just a professional soldier. Nothing too hard, never complained, was robust and resilient as you would expect Western Australian sort of farm boys to be. But great friend. I knew him for a long time, and we're always because I was a Langford, he was a Langley, so we're always never too far from each other. And he's a great human. So I dedicated my PhD to Todd, actually, because I felt in the sort of pantheon of commandos and how we remember them that Todd's a little bit underdone, and I felt that recognition is always justified when it comes to a person like that. Brett Wood, again, I knew Brett when I first got to 2 Commando. He was in Bravo Company with me. Very smart. A ready reservist originally. Out of Brisbane. Yeah. Served in 6RR. I went to Butterworth with him a couple of times, and all of my early deployments in East Timor, he was in my platoon. We did the Solomons again, and a couple of other overseas activities. Skills were superior. Thrived in high stress environments. It's one of those guys that you could see him when he went from 2nd to 3rd gear. You could see it.
Yep.
He'd get that sort of glint in his eye and away he'd go. But just professional to a fault. Could plan and conduct everything from a rudimentary room floor combat drill in the context of a counter-terrorism recovery mission, all the way through to complex multi-phase missions in places like Afghanistan and other areas. But the other thing about Brett was he's a wonderful trainer, so he could train soldiers really well. His methods of instruction were excellent, and that inspired also a lot of confidence in his subordinates as well. But again, great Australian, served his country and paid the ultimate price. But his happiest times in his life was with Elvie, his wife, followed by his role as a leader in Afghanistan. He loved it, thrived on it. And so my memories are very precious of him and his service. So, yeah.
And as you say, he from what I've heard and from other operators is that when he was awarded his medal for gallantry, you only have to see, as you say, he was leading from the front saying, on me, let's go, and high stress environment, and just exactly right, exactly what he was. And for Todd as well. And the tragedy of that for the listeners, Ian, is they were killed within a couple of months of each other, wasn't it? It was within a 6-week period, I think it was, and that must have been for the regiment. That must have been that must have put shockwaves through the regiment.
Well, when you lose a sergeant, you lose the 15, 20 years of experience that goes with it. You can't replace them necessarily. When you lose 2 of them in 6 weeks, and they were both very highly qualified and sought after, both in the war roles but also in the CT roles as well. I mean, that has a profound effect in terms of succession and even just the fundamentals of career planning. So that's sort of the pragmatic side of it. But I mean, those two are iconic, as you expect senior NCOs to be. I mean, Brett, when he got his MG, he sort of was awarded that alongside Ray Hasty, who was awarded his SG for the Objective Nile operation and Rotation 3. He was embarrassed by it. And I say that genuinely. That always sat awkwardly with him. He no doubt deserved it, probably more, but he was always embarrassed by that recognition, felt that he didn't want to be singled out, and it sat really uncomfortably with him. Now, he wore it because as a soldier you do that on behalf of others, but that's for an act of gallantry, so that's for him. But that never sat well with him. But I think that's also a testament to his character and the sort of person he was. So. And
you mentioned too, we mentioned a little bit earlier, Cameron Baird, VCMG. What are your memories of Cam? And I know that from what I've heard that he's very similar to Brett, that didn't like wearing his Medal for Gallantry and just thought he was just doing his job that day because he was awarded that from 2007 and just what are your memories of Cam?
Yeah, well, again, in regimental life, you spend most of your time walking around in cams or overalls, and so the whole issue of medals and everything else just doesn't break.
Yep.
It just doesn't feature really. And half the guys don't wear them on Anzac Day either. So it's an interesting sort of factoid, but no doubt deserved. But Cameron Bear was everything that his sort of subsequent legend tells you need to know. He was iconic, big, physically robust, loud, and I say that in a positive way, but just an inspirational natural leader. So again, soldiers lead not by rank or by appointment, but by virtue and by character. That's how soldiers lead. So if you're a private or if you're lieutenant colonel, you lead, follow, you get out of the way, and let others do the job. So, and he was that. It wouldn't matter, corporal, sergeant, private. He just had the personality for it, and he exercised it regularly. So, where there would be moments, that there was an absence, someone like Cameron Baird, and Cameron, as he often did, would step into the breach, and it's the old, come the hour, come the man, come the woman as well, of course. But that's certainly the case with Cameron Baird, and so I just emphasise that what's talked about in terms of his character and his memory, it can't be overstated because it's absolutely true. He was a big personality. He's a wonderful Australian. He didn't like that sort of recognition. He just wanted to get on with his job. Good bloke.
Yeah,
thoroughly. Yep.
In your opinion, if you can answer this, was the mission to fight the war on terror a success, looking back now?
It depends on how you sort of take that question. So, did we go to those theatres with the intention of, providing some overall positive benefit? And I'm simplifying this significantly, so forgive me.
No, that's okay.
Everyone went in with the right intention, but we don't do counterinsurgency well. The only two that we've done well really since 1945 have been the reconstruction of Germany and Japan, and that comes as a result of unconditional surrender. But unless you're prepared to invest generationally into counterinsurgency, unless you're prepared to offer forms of governance and security that is a better alternative to what previously existed, unless you're prepared to moderate and manage expectations that recognise in that part of the world systems of democracy and the kind of virtue that we thought we could project onto people that weren't willing to accept it, unless you can do those things, then ultimately, I don't think you can be. And the problem is hubris. We thought we could do it. We had the right intention. I mean, the initial response post 9/11 was very successful. With a few hundred special forces operators, with some proxy forces out of the Northern Alliance, and with US air power, we removed the Taliban as a threat, and we changed government in Afghanistan. So, to your question, from the 17th of October 2001 through to, the period when Kandahar fell and Mullah Omar did a runner, absolutely, mission accomplished.
Yep.
From that point onwards, it was a different story. And what's also important to distinguish is the service of our men and women doesn't correlate to the overall failure of strategy. And so that hubris that sat at the strategic level, it explains in part as to why we saw the tragedy we did in August of 2021. But it doesn't deny men and women that served in Afghanistan in our unit the right to reflect on honour in the context of their service and to be quite proud of that, notwithstanding the result overall.
So for you, how do you personally reflect on the achievements over there, and obviously the setbacks of the 41 soldiers who were killed, and particularly the Taliban taking back power in 2021.
You know, if you ask, and I won't speak for them, and I say this respectfully, if you ask friends and relatives of anyone that was lost, I mean, they would have a view that it wasn't worth it, and I'm entirely sympathetic to that.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that. I'd probably have the same view. Do we want to live in a world where, you know, henchmen and bad people can just perpetuate violence on whoever they choose? No, we don't. And, you know, as is often the quote, you know, sort of evil prospers when good people do nothing. And so the virtue around our contribution was right. And the commitment and the dedication and the performance of our people means that we should reflect very proudly on them and what they did. But the hubris every generation has, that it thinks it can do it better than the last one, and the failure to devise a strategy which is appropriate to the circumstances and to have the conviction to be able to execute it in a way that honours the service of our soldiers. I'm talking about having strategy that is as genuine and has the same integrity as our people have. That's the challenge. That's the statecraft bit that I think bears thinking about. And that's where I think we've got some reflection to do as a country. You know, if you're going to go to war, our people deserve for us to go properly. If you're going to send soldiers to war, and, you know, aviators and sailors, then be prepared to pay for it. Don't half commit.
Yep.
You know, because there's a tendency that some people like sending people to war, they just don't want to pay for it. And that's the moral conviction. And coming back to the questions around courage, there's all sorts of dedication to physical courage. I'm talking about moral courage, and I'm talking about that at the policy and strategy level. And there are people that have that. But I think having it more prominent in our national discussion around these sorts of things would be helpful. And if we learn one thing about Afghanistan, is that we have to own our own strategy. We can't send 1,500 plus Australians into a foreign part of the world and not put an Australian on the field in command. You know, they're the sorts of things that on reflection we'd think about, we'd wonder about. You know, having a national commander in another country is fine for national policy, but if you put half a brigade in a province and you put them in a risk profile that necessitates the use of heavy artillery, then you want an Australian on the ground in command. And they're the sorts of things that bear thinking about. Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep.
In 2016, you left the Special Forces space and became the Director Army Strategic position you held till 2018. What were you doing here, and what was it like after leaving that Special Forces space and coming back to the regular army?
So when I, great friend and mentor of mine, Major General Craig Orme, he was my JTF commander in Iraq. Fantastic. I mean, as a general in the army, he's one of our very best. He's a bit of a hero of mine, but he said to me, you know, Ian, you've led part of an army, now you've got to learn how to build one. So I took that seriously and was able to sort of go to Forces Command as the plans officer and think about how to design force elements at the sort of division level and above, brigades in the division.
Yep.
And then extrapolate that to the sort of ADF level as part of Army headquarters here in Canberra. And that sort of, you know, manifested into building objective forces and, you know, how you bring capital, operating and sustainment to these military capabilities in a way that is you can benchmark relative to threat, so it needs to be superior in its design and fit for purpose in terms of its role, but then how you can resource that and manage it as a system of systems, if you like, over years. So, you know, again, to put it simply, how to build an army, how to build a joint force. Yep.
So you did that role until 2018, and then from 2018 to 2021, you were the Director General of the Future Land Warfare. What did this role entail?
So that was a great opportunity. So working directly for the Chief of Army, effectively on executing his intention around force design, around concepts and capabilities, around emerging and future technology, and then aligning that to capital investment. So it's about bringing, for example, artificial intelligence, quantum and robotics into the capability system, so I can give you the kind of advantage that we have always typically relied upon. So, we need to access our friends and allies, and we need access to technology to maintain a capability edge relative to others. And my role in Future Land Warfare was to do that from an Army point of view.
So could you incorporate some of all what you'd learn at being in Special Forces and incorporate that as well as what the bigger Army wanted as well?
Yep, that's right. But also what I'd learnt at Commander Staff College in the US, what I'd learnt doing my PhD, what I thought was important in terms of how to benchmark and sort of measure capability compared to others, and then where the opportunities sit inside the defence capability life cycle and how to make the department work for Army. Again, there's a whole system, culture, process that you need to master if you're going to make the acquisition system, if you're going to make the bureaucracy work to your benefit.
Absolutely. So, after 30 years of serving in the ADF, you retired as Brigadier, having held command in Special Force units and also going back to main Army. Did you ever think as a young lieutenant that you would have such a highly distinguished career? And looking back, what are you most proud of in those 30 years of service?
Mate, I joined the Army and I wanted to be an infantry corporal section commander. That's all I wanted to be. Anything in addition to that was a bonus. And, to the happiest times I've had in the Army, the most fulfilling have always been in command. So that's everything from being a platoon commander in 1 RA, in 12 Platoon Delta Company, being the reconnaissance and surveillance platoon commander in 1 RA. My best times training was being recon platoon commander in Townsville. Loved it. And, I just think it's such a great privilege to be given that role. And again, the talent of people that I served with was incredible. And most of them would end up in SF somewhere. I've run into them again. And then, coming into Special Forces at the time where it coincided with the East Timor intervention, but then obviously 9/11, which changed everything. And then essentially, to come back to my point about you're always thinking about operations, from really April 2001 when we went into East Timor. In fact, no, from 99-2000 when in effect kicked off, through to the end of 2015, I was focused on force generating for operations, so 15 plus years.
Yep.
For all of us that serve in the military and in other emergency services, being given the opportunity to command and lead people in unusual and sometimes stressful and at-risk situations, and to come through it and to make mistakes and have the full experience is just such a privilege. So, there's probably not one thing I'm especially proud of. I really do think my time in operations and on operational command was a blessing and such a privilege, and I think that's what matters to me. That's the bit that I protect and hold dear more than anything else, and also doing their service justice in sort of the years going forward. So there's a lot of conjecture, there's a lot of reconciliation that's going to have to happen over the coming years, but let's not lose sight of just the contribution of our people, their best intention they had going into many of these commitments, the problems they had to solve in the absence of clear information, and the fact that, they did the best they could, and we should be proud of them. And that's what I reflect on, and I certainly am.
Absolutely. And so looking back now and all you've experienced and gone through in your life, was joining the Army still the best decision you ever made?
I think so.
Yeah.
I wouldn't discourage people from military service. I think we shouldn't take people's all-volunteer status as something for granted. I reflect less on the service. I reflect more on in-service. So it's a fancy way of saying I just love working with the people I worked with.
Yep.
And that's what's most special to me. Yeah.
And for you now, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to any young person who is thinking of going into Special Forces and for training, getting prepared mentally, going on selection? What advice would you give to them?
I think it's a worthy and honourable cause, but once you get bitten, you'll be addicted. So that's a benefit and it's a warning at the same time.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yep.
I just loved it. Yeah. So.
It's great advice that, you, as you say, 100% if you're going to commit, you're going to commit. And as you say, be careful of what you do wish for because it bites hard and, and it gets you.
Look, it's not for everyone. It's comes with all sorts of challenges and obligations, but it's such a privilege and I loved it. Yeah.
So, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self and would he listen?
Probably. I think, in all seriousness, I make the most of every opportunity. I think you get one shot at this. And when you're in those appointments where, you're in command of soldiers, there's no higher purpose, there's no greater obligation, and it's just such a privilege. So I think I've said that several times, but I mean it. It's a real privilege. It's not something that it should ever be taken for granted. And it's an obligation, but it's an opportunity as well. You will be remembered for good or for ill when you're in those positions on the decisions that you make. And so being a participative leader that's focused on achieving the task but also empowering your people to be the best versions of themselves, that's critical to success. And you want to be able to also reconcile after the fact your own performance and be comfortable that you did the best you could. So have no regrets would be that. Have no regrets would be the advice.
Yep.
Yep.
So, and for you, I look at it as that as you mentioned, leadership, it can be a lonely road, and you've got to make those tough calls as a leader. And so, what advice would you give to any CEO or any young person that would like to take on a leadership role?
Yep.
What advice can you give to them?
Don't allow yourself to be lonely. So I understand your point around the loneliness of, I think it's decision making, because again it's about responsibility. But I think leadership's a bit of a team sport. So being open and transparent and engaged with your workforce, you can't be the expert in everything, and you shouldn't be. And make leadership a social pastime. So, involve others, but recognise, to sort of paraphrase Harry S. Truman on his desk in the White House, the buck stops here. So you're the decision maker, you're responsible. Everyone loves the high fives of success, but when things get a bit tough or they go wrong, suddenly find yourself, again looking around for a chair and everyone's already taken one. But that's just part of the business. You have to be accountable, you have to be responsible, and that's both for the good and the not so good. So, that's the obligation to lead, and it comes in all sort of facets of business and military leadership and civil society. The other one is, and this is sort of Albert Camus inspired, is that we're all prey to our truth. So you've got to be able to reconcile your decisions to yourself. You've got to be able to accept mistakes. You've got to be able to forgive yourself. You're not perfect all the time. And you just got to be able to explain and rationalise to yourself why you did things and when you did it. It's not about living with regret, but it's about being able to forgive yourself, because not always the decision will be perfect, and sometimes you make the wrong decision. The challenge is not to make the wrong decision twice.
Yeah.
You just learn to forgive yourself.
And I think too, it's learn from your failures too, because sometimes sometimes the greatest lessons are learned through failure.
Yep.
Winning all the time is not, it too, and it's not. You can't win all the time. It's just not possible. You have to have times where you do fail, and you have to, and you learn from those failures.
Yep. I have decisions from, East Timor in 2001, and I find myself on a run or whatever, and I'd stop and literally kick myself because of the decision I made. And this is my point, right?
Yeah.
So you go mad doing that. So you got to learn to forgive yourself. Recognise what it is, have the contemplation and the self-reflection to, compartmentalise it, forgive yourself, and then move on. Because otherwise you drive yourself nuts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for you now, you've now out of the army, and what are you doing now? What does life look like outside of the army?
Still finding out. So I'm doing a whole bunch of different things. What I enjoy doing at the moment is trying things that I couldn't do. So that's everything from working with universities through to helping sort of startups do market entry, and that's all very fascinating. So. But again, transition out of service is different for everyone. I would say, again, don't judge others. Be really kind to yourself and recognise that it takes time. Getting 32 years of military service out of my system is not going to take 6 months. Some people told me it takes 3 or 4 years. But just be kind to yourself. You're allowed to be upset. You're allowed to be, you can have moments where you sort of wish it wasn't the case, but it's always, you come back to the reality of your circumstance and get on with it. So, I just think, be kind to yourself. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. And that's, as you say, some soldiers do struggle with that transition.
Yeah.
They really do, and it's getting better, but there's still, as you say, just be kind, and everything, every transition is going to be different.
Yeah, it's different for everyone. So, and again, man, I would point to, I've got ex-soldiers of mine, signallers, who are now, having sold their company, have achieved everything in life to include, high net worth. And these are guys and girls that sort of, I remember sitting in the dash somewhere in Uruzgan province, a 50-degree day, and everyone, even the enemy, gave up. We all sort of just lay down and got through the heat. And he was devising his business plan, which has now turned into a multinational company, which is a success. And again, it's always humbling when you see how wonderful our people are.
Yeah.
I've seen there's people that are doing amazing things post-service, and you talk to them, you say, how did you do that? And of course, when you start talking about transition, they have all the same problems, all the same frustrations, and yet they find a way through. So there's real hope and inspiration out there in the form of what veterans have gone on and achieved, and I think people should pay attention to that.
Absolutely.
So, because there is a way forward. Soldiers are not victims. Service is honourable. It is part of who you are. It's how you identify with the world. It's how the world identifies with you. But your time is over, and you need to be able to commemorate that service, be really proud of it, but not spend the rest of your life looking back. You've got to look forward, and you've got to do that in the context of sort of reconciling everything and moving forward. And it's very hard though, so I forgive anyone who is challenged, because I think it's common to everyone. It's a challenge for everyone, and the experience is different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
so for you now, what are your plans going forward with your family? What do you want to achieve with them going forward into the future?
I want them to be happy, have purpose, be humble, and focus on what matters. So
and you putting back into, as you say now, being a dad and enjoying some family time.
Yeah, they don't trust me. They still think I'm going to go away. My eldest, and to be fair to her, I've done 3 deployments where the flash to bang from I'm here through to I'm out the door, one was less than half an hour, and I was gone for 7 months. So she doesn't trust me. And she's an army brat.
Yeah.
So it's pretty typical.
And
Maybe.
just to say, it's all right. Dad's here. He's staying.
I don't think she believes me. One day.
Ian, your story is one of true inspiration. You've served your country with honour and your family with pride. You are clearly an inspiration to so many. And there's a quote that I would like to finish up that I believe sums up your story, and if I may share it. Perseverance is the secret of all triumphs. It's part of my Special Forces training. You're taught to come up with a solution, not look for excuses, and without warning you strike. Brigadier Ian Langford, DSC and BARS, thank you for your service, and thank you for coming on True Blue Conversations and sharing your story. It's been an absolute honour and a privilege. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I always try to do my best.
Great way to end the podcast, and great advice to anyone out there who listens to this. Always do your best.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
Welcome, loyal listeners of True Blue Conversations. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Australian Warfighter Coffee. Veteran owned and run, driven by a simple yet powerful motto: people over profit. Every dollar goes towards supporting veterans and first responder charity groups. Head on over to AustralianWarfighters.com and use the code TrueBlue for your exclusive discount. Because let's face it, any other coffee is just brown sadness water. Now, let's get on with the show. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Blum. See you on the front line.